elites and from state actors and from the oligarchs. And observers commonly see corruption as the glue of Putin's systema, right? If you think about the scholar of Russian corruption, Alena Ledineva, she uses this term systema. Henry Hale's excellent book, Patronal Politics, revolves around the issue of how these pyramids hold together, if you will. So if we had to use an image, a metaphor for this common view of Russian corruption, in fact, Egyptian pyramid is not a bad one, right? What I want to suggest to you today is another metaphor, and that is one of sand castle, right? The idea here is that Russian corruption is not so much cement holding together a pyramid as it is water holding together a sand castle. Too little or too much water and the sand won't hold. As we will see, there are quite a bit of centrifugal forces in the Russian system, as I will detail in a few minutes, pulling the system apart. So my published book deals with these disintegrating forces that are integral to Russian corruption and that undermine the Russian system that Putin built. And my current work deals more with the top of the sandcastle that is actually holding very well together. This is, the top of the castle. This is about oligarchs and Putin. So I'll try to touch on both sides during the presentation, but obviously in a very telegraphic manner, and then we can elaborate during the Q&A. So let me share a few insights from both the bottom of the sandcastle and the top. So in terms of the bottom, I implemented a survey in Russia, and what I wanted to get at is the nature of non-oligarchic corruption. In terms of the survey details, so this is regionally representative. I had a response rate of 47%. About 396 firms actually responded to the survey. This is restricted on size, so this is mostly about medium-sized enterprises, medium to large, and it's restricted on sectors, so this is manufacturing only. The individual items here are basically different ways in which the state can threaten business through corruption. And what I ask the firms is, well, how serious are these problems for your business? And in fact, the responses here are already ordered in the descending order of intensity. In other words, most businesses think that taxation agencies are a problem, right? Specifically extortion by taxation agencies. The second most frequently cited item is illegal inspections by regulatory agencies. Then we have administrative barriers to obtaining licenses and permits. Same thing, licenses and permits, but for the sale or transfer of land and real estate. Hostile use of state resources by competitors. Raiding is a very interesting phenomenon that I will elaborate on in a little bit. Administrative pressure for financial contributions to various social funds, pressure for informal payments / bribes, and finally illegal interference with hiring or firing of labor, so things like forced nepotism. This is how it actually loads in terms of average responses. Here I also have Ukraine, just for comparison, so these are the same responses we just saw on the previous slide, but with numbers. Averages being 1 to 4, 4 being highest, most intense threat. Now these numbers are more about the frequency with which firm experiences these problems, but a different way to slice the data is to ask, well, which threats are more detrimental to business? Some of them might not occur too frequently, but they could be very devastating, right? Think about expropriation. It might not occur every day, like bribes, right? But it actually eliminates the business as such. So I sliced the data a different way, where I separated threats to income, these more kind of shallow demands for bribes, from the deeper threats to ownership itself, right? And here we're talking raiding or supporting with administrative resources the firm's competitors, right? So this would be the ownership threat as opposed to income threat. The third one here is a purely private threat of extortion rackets. They were very prevalent in Russia in the 1990s. Throughout the former Soviet Union, in fact, but as we can see relative to the state threats, they have really declined. And again, we have numbers for Ukraine just for comparison. Here, a quick regression. This is nothing too difficult, but basically was interesting to me to test whether the impact of ownership threats, these deeper threats, versus income threats, are more devastating for the investment climate. And in fact, they are. What's interesting is that threat to income doesn't even register with a negative sign, right? The dependent variable, the outcome I'm interested in here is predictability of state threats for the future, which is very important for business. That's what we mean when we say investment climate, right? In other words, the first two lines here really give us the dual nature of the sandcastle, right? When it comes to income threats, it might actually be holding the system together. But when it comes to ownership threats, it is pulling it apart. Okay, next, remember I mentioned rating as one of the threats. So this is really the key threat to ownership rights in Russia. And it has been for over 15 years, despite multiple initiatives to counteract it. The statistics are a little mind-boggling. It's very hard to find true statistics on the number of raids conducted in Russia. But it's somewhere, and the spread is huge, between 10,000 and unbelievably 700,000 per year. The number 700,000 comes from the 2015 National Anti-Corruption Committee report in Russia. Today, what partly explains this big number is that today it's mostly small and medium-sized enterprises that are targets, and there is just many more of them than there are of large enterprises. Okay, so what exactly, and a very nice quote here from a CEO I interviewed, if you are not a target, something is wrong with your business, right? This just gives you an idea how widespread it is, right? Basically, if you have a good, profitable business, you will be a target, right? So it's important to understand this phenomenon of rating. And in the book, I give schematically the 5 stages of a successful rating attack, and the role different state actors play in each stage. So here I will mention a few things very briefly. The first stage, intelligence acquisition. So this is about obtaining information about the company's outstanding debts, track record of any legal violations, information on industrial relations, for example, any conflict with labor. And a lot of this state actors can obtain within regular business inspections. However, if they need to go deeper, they can also obtain a search warrant based on suspected economic crimes, right? And that basically neutralizes the company's corporate security protections, lawyers, and so forth, that gives state actors more direct access to the company's data. Okay, so now intelligence acquisition was stage 1. Stage 2, asset fixation. So if raiders target specific assets of the enterprise, for example, buildings, lands, or machine, they aim to make it impossible for the victim to transfer these assets once the attack becomes apparent. And here the Russian courts play a key role. The term in Russian is обеспечительные меры, which basically means that the court issues a property arrest. Right? Once that is issued, you cannot do anything with the property, even though you realize your property is under attack. The third, the ominous sounding neutralization of main owners. So raiders strive to freeze not only the assets, but also restrict the decision-making powers of the enterprise owners. Here, regional taxation agencies are key. Basically, if you hit somebody with a huge tax bill, you can shut down production. And you also deplete the cash reserves of the owners. So they have less cash to hire lawyers, less cash to engage in protecting their enterprise. Sometimes even things like sanitation agencies or fire agencies play a role here because, again, they just cite any violation of the code, they can shut down the enterprise. Asset seizure. So most often, the methods of force where state actors basically storm the enterprise with guns drawn. That's in the past. What happens today is that owners most often sell at duress, right? Sell under duress. In other words, given the ongoing attack, they realize they will lose the enterprise sooner or later, and they come to a deal with the state actors, selling it often for 10 to 20% of market value, right? This is this step. And the last step is, I think, the most interesting, asset anchorage. Here the idea is once you have raided or expropriated the assets, you want to make it irreversible in case there are any future claims, right, from the legitimate owners to get it back. So here offshores can play a role. There are a few schemes that I describe in the book. My favorite one is called in Russian прививка or vaccination. So what happens that the raiders, through an affiliated firm, file a lawsuit against themselves. Right? This is a firm that ostensibly has no relationship to lawyers. They sue no relationship to raiders. They sue the raiders, and that firm loses the lawsuit on purpose. And under Russian code, you cannot sue somebody twice for the same crime. Right, so this vaccinates against any future proceedings. So then the legitimate owners come to the judge and say, hey, we were just expropriated, we want an investigation. The judge looks it up. Oh, sorry, that case has already been heard. Done. Right? Vaccination. And I love the Russian euphemisms. I mean, vaccination, how cool is that? So anyhow, okay, so this is on rating. Another, oh. PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. Okay. Another excellent quote from my interviews in Russia: hostile takeovers in the West are just a tad friendlier than our friendly takeovers. If you take a minute to think about it, it's actually pretty clever. This is just a friendly image of 9-to-5 bureaucrats in Russia. So far we might have the picture in mind of evil state against good business, right? But as with all things Russian, it's complicated. Some businesses, you might imagine, would actually actively participate in raiding or pay state actors to do it so as to expropriate their rivals. So I wanted to get at this propensity for business aggression, business willingness to engage in predation themselves. It's very difficult empirically, right? You don't ask business, well, how often do you actually engage in raiding? Right? So the question I asked in my survey is this. Okay. To what extent do you agree with the following statement? The poor protection of property rights presents not only a threat, but also an opportunity for business growth. So this is very mildly phrased expression that does not incriminate the respondent in any way, right? But presumably, if somebody agrees to a large extent with the statement, that enterprise would also be more likely to engage in raiding. And basically, 24% of Russian firms either agree or strongly agree with this statement, which is interesting. This is what I do here. The dependent variable here is this propensity for aggression. That's the outcome. What I wanted to test is, does it matter whether business actors see the state as an Egyptian pyramid or a sandcastle? In other words, do they blame the central state or the local state for insecure property rights? And does that have an impact on whether they themselves participate in predation? What this outcome, the first two lines here tell us, is that it's much more likely, it's much more detrimental to business incentives to see the system as a sandcastle. So if they see the system as already being pulled apart by predation, not under control of the Kremlin, they basically want a piece of the pie themselves. That's kind of the takeaway from this line. Okay. So what are some of the factors suggesting that Russia is more like a sandcastle than simply a top-down corrupt pyramid? So one set of factors is about the idea that corruption often undermines Putin's own priorities. And I will not go through all the items here, but in the book I basically describe how this rampant predation and raiding have undermined things that Putin personally clearly cares about, like things like share of Gazprom imports to Europe, right? Things like defense contracts with Jordan that Putin personally negotiated with the King of Jordan, right? And then the factory making, I think it was rockets, it was raided by state actors, and the Jordanians basically pulled out last minute, and Putin was personally embarrassed. So there are all these things where you see that it's not about kind of Putin being firmly in control, but there is no doubt he's at the top, right? But this idea that things are much more interesting once you look deeper inside, right? So it's not Putin rules over all. And in fact, and it doesn't just concern economics. And by the way, here the FSB gave a very interesting report to the Russian Chamber of Commerce on raiding, detailing 200 defense enterprises being raided by state actors. So basically some of the critical makers of tanks, rockets, propeller grenades, whatever they are. And the FSB's conclusion was that these are no longer conflicts between economic subjects, this is a threat to national security. Of course, we all know that some of the FSB actors themselves sometimes pose that very threat, right? So things are complicated. The last point here is that it's not just about economics and assets, it's also about politics. For example, remember the 2011 protests and the Duma election in which Putin at all costs wanted United Russia to get 50% of the vote, and they didn't, which was quite embarrassing. A big reason for why they didn't is that people running the election campaign, United Russia members, were pocketing a lot of campaign expenditure money, right? So basically, here's a nice quote from a watchdog, from a Russian analyst who has access to the Kremlin. Before, Putin had a fear syndrome about unmanaged elections. Now, he has acquired a fear syndrome about the possibility of failure of managed elections. Kickbacks and the theft of funds allocated for the campaign reached 70%. The campaign headquarters fabricated reasons for the tremendous campaign expenditures, that is, funds stolen from the budget. Actual work was minimal, just enough to conceal theft. Right, so here, the key idea is that even Putin's imperative of staying in power, right, through electoral manipulation, for example, is often jeopardized by this disorganized predation. And of course, when we think about the rise of opposition to Putin, right, this is Navalny, the only credible opposition candidate today in Russia who actually has some support. What is behind his popularity? It's predation, it's corruption, right? So this is another kind of unintended consequence of Putin, of trying to manage the sandcastle, but it being very hard, right? Here I just quickly asked entrepreneurs what they think the potential remedies would be for insecure property rights, comparing democratic control of national government versus incorruptibility of local state agents. More entrepreneurs think that it's all about local regions, as opposed to kind of blame everything on Moscow. But that doesn't mean much, because they could be just wrong, right? This is just opinion. So I will almost skip this theoretical stuff on stakeholder alliances, but just to signal to you, one argument I make in the book is that I say, look, things are actually not like this, big scary state, small vulnerable firm. Things are much more like this, many state actors acting independently. What this means is that the power balance between state and firm is actually more equal in many instances of state-business conflicts. And what I investigate is how firms can build alliances with influential foreigners, labor, and communities around the firm, and actually protect their property against local predation, specifically against raiding, for example, right? So this is an argument I make in the book. Again, I'm skipping it here. Largely, in the book, I describe different ways in which stakeholders can protect the firm, different types of costs they can impose on the aggressors, so financial, political, costs of public perception, physical costs, actually protecting the enterprise. I have some cases in the backup slides, so we could go back to that if we want. A few quotes on the effectiveness of stakeholder alliances at the non-elite level, so the bottom of the sandcastle. I also what I do is I reinterpret the case of Yukos in the following manner. So Yukos is a very high-profile case where we all know the main shareholder, Khodorkovsky, lost to Putin, ended up in jail, lost his stake in the company. What I show is that for other shareholders of Yukos, right, Yukos had about 10,000 shareholders, Khodorkovsky was just one, right? Other shareholders relying on stakeholders, specifically pensioners of Yukos, and foreign top management, thanks to these stakeholders, they could access a variety of international courts. And what's pretty amazing is that the monetary awards against Yukos are some of the largest in history against a sovereign, right? And this sum has already been paid. This is now in question, appealed by the Russian Federation, but things are moving in a very interesting direction that often is lost in the orthodox kind of image of Yukos, you know, Yukos lost, Putin won. There is more there. I interviewed a representative from the Yukos legal team. This is an amazing quote that sort of portrays the battles around these issues. So after the Court of Appeals in the Netherlands confirmed that the sum must be exacted, Rosneft naturally did not pay. After that, with battle-like engagement, we have tracked their tankers and arrested a couple of Rosneft tankers with oil in Rotterdam. then froze the tankers. To unfreeze them, they showed their secret accounts. Based on these contracts, we traced the subsidiaries of Rosneft and their accounts. We obtained a court order and froze these accounts. After that, there was yet another small suit in a London court. Only then they paid. To get money from the Russians voluntarily is impossible. They never agreed to a settlement. One must punish them very severely. So one of the key arguments I make in the book is that stakeholders help the firms to punish state actors. Right? And now you know how to get money back away from me. Just find where I keep my oil. Right? This is the advice here. Okay. These are regressions showing that stakeholder alliances can be effective. So now a few concluding slides on the top of the sandcastle. So far we have been mostly talking about this predation that really interferes with the idea of Russia as a system, right? And we have tried to look at it both from the state point of view and from business. Now, when we move to the top and talk about oligarchs' relationship with Putin, we of course don't see too much strain in that relationship, right? The top of the sandcastle is still holding relative to the bottom. And I don't want to repeat what you've been reading in New York Times on the Russian oligarchs. There has been a lot of reporting. So I have actually been coding the data on 150 richest Russians. So I want to share with you some insights about that. This follows my work on Ukraine. So for Ukraine, I have done very detailed analysis of top oligarchs that was just published in Comparative Political Studies. And with Russia, I want to basically follow in those steps. So the first question I ask, how did the oligarchs become rich in the first place, right? When I say oligarchs, we're simply talking about the richest 150. What I find in terms of the size of the cohorts, right, the largest cohort remains by far oligarchs that became rich from privatization. This is the left axis. This is just number of individuals. So this is not percentage. This is almost 90 people out of 150. Interestingly, we see that we now begin to see the new generation of Russia's super rich emerging, right? This is inheritance. Anywhere in the West, this would be huge, right? But there is no old money in Russia, so this is all first generation. Director, people who didn't directly participate in privatization, but used to be directors of Soviet-era enterprises. From scratch needs elaboration. So don't think that this is, started a business and which became, kind of the new Facebook or whatever. A big caveat here is that half of these businesses in the from scratch category took off thanks to public procurement. In other words, these people, state contracts are now the key avenue through which many of Putin-era oligarchs have become super rich, right? So in sectors like infrastructure, defense, healthcare, the Russian budget has seen regular overcharging of the treasury to the tune of, tens of billions of dollars. So this is a lot of the so-called from scratch oligarchs come from there. So this is just about the size of the cohorts. What about their wealth? This is the axis here. So we see that privatization oligarchs by far remain the richest. This is the median wealth for each group. And the big shift, again, from Yeltsin-era oligarchs, privatization, to Putin-era oligarchs, public procurement, is between these two columns. Another point to note is that 80% of Russia's super rich, so the top 150 at least, had been super wealthy in the Yeltsin era. Right? So remember how Putin promised to kind of do away with things, so the overwhelming majority of them are doing quite fine. In terms of sectors in which the oligarchs are invested, so this is the percentage of people with the largest asset in a particular sector. So at the bottom we have the largest sectors: mining, construction, oil and gas. Right? So most of the Russian oligarchs have their largest asset in these sectors. And of course revenue from those sectors depends directly on state favor, right? In many cases. And this is the reason why The Economist, for example, when it did its crony capitalism index, coming back to your idea that state-business relations is about crony capitalism, Russia actually leads the world by percentage of revenue or by the percentage of GDP that is derived from crony sectors, right? So this is basically translating this slide to a global level, followed by Malaysia and the Philippines. Okay, we're almost done. Let's see, Kremlin's relationship with the oligarchs. So this idea that there was not much trouble at the top of the sandcastle, I think it's very nicely captured by Timchenko, the ex-head of gun war, a big oil trader. So in response to sanctions, where he basically lost a lot of money, and generally the top 20 oligarchs lost up to a quarter of their fortune, right, following 2014, Timchenko said, if need be, I will transfer everything to the state tomorrow or to charity. My wife and I have discussed this many times. Personally, we do not need billions. I mean, this is it. That just melts your heart. Right? But there is an asterisk, right? There is an asterisk there. So what's the asterisk? See following slide on charity. Okay. So Alexei Navalny did this amazing investigation that he just recently published about the role of charities and non-profit organizations at the top of the Russian sandcastle. And basically the scheme is this. There is a bunch of charities and non-profits to which the oligarchs donate money and state banks give loans. There are no formal end beneficiaries here, right? These are just non-profits. These non-profits, they have their own land, buildings, money accounts, sometimes even yachts. They don't do much in terms of actual work, charitable work. And then the Kremlin elites simply have informal access to all that stuff, right? This is not about ownership. This is very much the Soviet tradition, right? Where the people in the Kremlin could use all the duchess, all the resorts without formally owning anything. This is much more acceptable to the Russian people also to not see people like Putin personally using his castle, let's say, in a way that would be much more usual in some Central Asian republics, for example, right? Okay, so this kind of is a big asterisk on this idea that Timchenko will donate everything to the charity, right? So that makes much more sense now. It's much less fuzzy in this context, so kind of touchy-feely. Okay. This is very different from the bottom of the sandcastle in terms of the revenues that Russian non-elite state actors, but also private business derive. So they often directly own companies in the offshores or in Western jurisdictions, right? And those companies in turn then invest in land buildings and whatever else the Russians want. So part of it is purely legal in the sense that if this money was legally earned and this is legally done, there is no problem. The issue here is, of course, that a lot of this is dirty money, right? So this is dirty money escaping Russia, having been obtained through, theft from the budget, bribery, sometimes raiding of bank deposits, and so forth, right? And that presents a problem. This also, I think, is the key, this kind of huge capital flight from Russia, much of it dirty money.